Welcome, everybody. We're going to start. Welcome to the people in the room and to those online. I'm Raymond Whitaker. I'm UK Chair of the Commonwealth Journalists Association. Now, if you watched coverage of the recent Commonwealth Summit in Rwanda, I think here you would have thought most of it is about sending migrants from this country to an oppressive regime somewhere in Central Africa. And if you live in Birmingham, perhaps you're conscious that the Commonwealth Games is going to start soon. But that might be all that most people are aware of when it comes to the Commonwealth, which is a pity, because there's a great deal that goes on beneath the surface, a great deal useful and valuable goes on beneath the surface at the Commonwealth. It's really a collection of networks, and the Commonwealth Journalists Association is one of those. We are a network of journalists around the 52 members of the Commonwealth. In fact, it's now 53 since the latest member was allowed to join. And that is one of the most valuable aspects of the Commonwealth, is that people in the law, ministers of environment, all sorts of professional associations meet and share common values. And when it comes to the Commonwealth Journalists Association, our founding ethic is media freedom, and we stand for that, even though we are well aware that in many Commonwealth countries media freedom is not permitted. If we stand for nothing else, that is what we stand for. And this session today is a networking session, if it is nothing else. We don't want to just speak down to you. We want very much to hear from you, because, again, the Commonwealth needs refreshing. It needs a new generation that subscribes to the values that we are promoting. So I hope very much that in this networking session we hear as much from you as you hear from us. Now, so the first person I want you to hear from today is Rachel Corp, who is the editor of ITV Network News. She's one of the leading figures in British television news. Since 2020, she's been editor of ITV Network News, which is produced by ITN. She was acting editor for 2 years before that. And under her watch, ITN has broken a number of very important stories, including the notorious clip of Allegra Stratton joking about Partygate in 10 Downing Street, which forced her to resign as Boris Johnson's press secretary. I think the other thing I would single out is ITN's world-exclusive footage of the rioters inside the Capitol building in Washington last year. And that's been a crucial part in the investigation into the attempts to overturn the result of the 2020 US presidential election. Most of Rachel's career has been spent at ITN, which she first joined as a trainee more than 3 decades ago. She's risen through the ranks, helped to launch Channel 5 News, and later served as its editor. As a producer, she covered major stories in the UK and abroad, from Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where I'm surprised we never met, but as well as at home, the Hutton inquiry, which again, I was there.
We were probably next to each other,
Yeah.
not realising.
At the Surrey murders, I wasn't there. As editor of ITV Network News, Rachel leads a team of more than 300 people in the UK and abroad, and is responsible for a multi-million-pound budget. Recently it was announced that she will take over as CEO of ITN in September. I can't think of anyone better qualified to tell us about prospects for journalism in the digital age, the theme of this conference. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, absolutely lovely to be here talking to you, and very much those who've dialed in remotely as well. And as you say, this conference is looking at excitement and risk and the prospects for journalists in the digital age. And really, it couldn't come at a busier time for us journalists. I have to say, I can't remember a time when any of us felt things were a bit quiet, or we sat back and put our feet up and complained we were a bit bored. But I think the news agenda of the last few years has been particularly relentless. And times like this are exciting for us. It's what makes us tick. It gets us out of bed in the mornings. It gives us purpose, and it's why we love our jobs. Yet, as we know, our industry feels constantly under attack at times. It's changing rapidly. Nothing can be taken for granted, which I can imagine is quite daunting for those of you starting your careers at the moment. And I really wanted to discuss this through the prism of my experience and talk a bit more about my background, really, and what I learnt along the way, which I hope might be useful to you. You've had a lovely summary of my CV there, so you know a bit about me, but I'll pick a few of those bits out and the things that stood out for me, really. So in terms of all of this, I feel I slightly fell into journalism. I never really had a grand plan, and I have to say I never had a plan for anything along the way. I think at one stage when I was at school and asked what I wanted to be, I said an actress, a lawyer, or a scientist, or I wanted to be famous enough to have a pub named after me. And so far I haven't done any of those things, but I think in a funny way journalism means a bit of all of that and more. But I think the thing for me is I was always interested in people, different cultures, different communities, what makes a person do what they do. So when I was at university, a group of students said, we're going to set up a radio station, which was quite hard at the time. And I thought, that sounds really fun, so I joined. And in the way of quite a lot of student projects, pretty much everybody dropped out pretty quickly. So I ended up with a grand title of Head of News and Current Affairs and presenter of most of our news and current affairs programmes. So very few of us, but fantastic training. And it made me think about not only what was important to me, but was also what was relevant to others, and finding people who had something interesting to say, but how to counterbalance that with a different view and crucially remain impartial, and how to have impact, but also the fallout you can have from tackling the controversial subjects. Our programmes won awards, which is great, and led to work experience at BBC Radio in topical programmes, of which there were lots at the time, and I found it eye-opening. I saw how top broadcasters found their stories, how they developed them, and what worked and what didn't. And pretty soon I was pitching my own stories and being paid as a freelance reporter to work on them. And I loved this. Really hard work, but great fun. And for me, the best training in so many ways, because in order to buy my next day's train ticket or to buy drinks down the pub, I had to spot stories and how to tell them, and then find the producers or commissioners who wanted to buy them. And that was about original ideas that others weren't telling. Sometimes scraps I read in the paper, or things I picked out of conversations with people, friends or people in the street, things I saw and I wondered about. And really this is the key thing that I always say to anybody starting out in careers. No one has a monopoly on all the good stories. Even the most senior people, we run out of ideas. We definitely miss things, or we just haven't heard about things. And whatever stage of your career, if you have good ideas, you will stand out. And it doesn't even need to be the next biggest award-winning investigation or a huge scoop. It might just be someone interesting to interview about an issue. Your suggestions are as valid as those of us who've been doing it for 3 decades, I think you said. Whilst I was freelancing, the war in Bosnia had been going on for a number of years. Yet it had fallen out of the news, and I felt I no longer understood what was going on. And if I didn't, I felt that others must have been feeling the same. I met a reporter who had been covering the war and was due to go back. So I basically asked if I could jump in and go with him. And it was a huge experience with terrifying moments. But it opened me up to the real value of eyewitness reporting, of going into communities and talking to people and piecing together what was going on, not just reading it somewhere else, and then finding a way to translate it to listeners in the UK that was relatable to them. I particularly focused on young people who I felt I related to, but their lives were effectively being stolen when they were the very future that was needed for the country, and I wanted to get their stories heard. If you are fortunate not to be born into a war zone, I really don't recommend anybody now going there to try and make it, which I think journalists have felt they had to in the past. Things are rightly so different now in terms of safety and the way we view safety. But also journalists in so many places are so-called legitimate targets, not the vital neutral observers, and I think that's changed a lot. But I have to say those skills of eyewitness reporting, of getting out there into the field, to the heart of a story, talking to those most affected, are fundamental to impactful journalism that resonates across the world, wherever you are, and are invaluable, really, whatever the story. Off the back of this, I landed a role as a trainee at ITN, which some of you will know is the production company that makes commercial broadcast news in the UK, and saw me very much moving into news and TV and a variety of roles, some of which you mentioned, but I was part of the launch team of Channel 5 News, which is very much a startup culture, very innovative at the time, very much all hands on deck. So I would run the news desk or present or do camera work or technical work in the gallery, and quite often all in the same shift. And it was all about initiative and also seizing opportunities and about taking risks in the positive sense, trying new ideas, pushing boundaries, but within that frame of mainstream regulated news. Then to ITV News and field producing, some of which you've mentioned, in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, and covering big UK stories. And I have to say, for me, I think that was the best job in my career so far. Now, as a producer, you have to make your team work, but also be competitive, doing what it takes to get your team ahead, to beat the opposition, to find the right people to talk to, hopefully exclusively, and drive new angles on the story and the most powerful pictures. And I learned how to be ambitious about having impact with the stories we were telling and everyone was talking about that day, to chase down and hold authority to account. Crazy long hours, no idea when I'd come home. I could leave on a Monday, come back 3 weeks later, but also really full of purpose. And I feel I learnt the great humility of being welcomed into people's homes, often at the worst moments in their lives, and the duty to make sure that they were heard. Now, I moved to the BBC in Russia as a senior producer at a time of great change in the area, not as much as now, but I then had my daughters, 2 daughters, and worked for a production company running their digital channels. Then went back to ITN about 11 years ago to ITV News and went from news editor, head of UK News, editor of ITV London, running news in the capital, back to Channel 5, as you mentioned, as editor, and I'm now editor of ITV News. And some of you will be familiar with this, but I'm not sure everybody is who's joined us. So ITV is the biggest independent commercial broadcaster in the UK. And alongside the BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5, we're also a public service broadcaster, which means ITV has a duty to provide content that's in the public interest, including high quality news, which is impartial, fair, and balanced. And we're regulated by a government body, Ofcom, who rigorously uphold these principles. When I started as editor, acting editor effectively, my aims were to prioritise bold, distinctive journalism that would have real impact and cut through, and raise the profile of our flagship News at 10 programme, giving it an edge and more of a voice, a reason for people to come and watch us, to accelerate the move to digital, taking our news to audiences wherever they wanted to see it, and to massively diversify the people contributing to our content, both on and off screen. My time as editor has also coincided with some of the biggest stories of this era. Just a few: Ukraine, COVID, Brexit. Politics is at its most divisive in the UK, the US, and globally. And we have the climate emergency, Black Lives Matter, the growing gulf between those who have and have not, and so much more. Add into that the explosion of social media, the ever more sophisticated techniques of propaganda, mis and disinformation, the speed of delivery of content. Audiences have fragmented. They consume their news in ever more different ways, and little can be taken for granted. For me, this means there's never been a more important time for the sort of trusted, impartial news that we in the PSB system prioritises and protects. People have been talking about and predicting the death of TV news bulletins for years. But as Ukraine recently and COVID in particular showed, when it matters, people want to be able to turn quickly and easily to news that they can trust. Our viewing figures rocketed in 2020, but were rising before and have stayed strong. It wasn't just the COVID blip. We recently doubled the length of our early evening news programme, and our ratings remain high throughout that programme. So now along. Trust me, though, is something you earn, and we can't take these audiences for granted. So really, for me, it's meant focusing on all those things I talked about that I learnt along the way. The importance and power of eyewitness reporting, putting people at the heart of your storytelling, always thinking about your audiences and making your content relevant and relatable to them. Not following the so-called news agenda, but working out the stories that matter most to people with original, confident journalism, taking risks and pushing boundaries, holding those in power to account. The impact an ambitious and driven team can have by working together with impartiality at its core. Plus something for me as an editor which underpins everything, which for me I've prioritised from day one, a culture of inclusion, a diversification of the people in our news teams, as well as those voices that contribute to our content, a place where we seek all views and ideas and constantly question our assumptions, are prepared to experiment and take risks. So you've mentioned a few of our examples, but I'll talk you through a bit more of that. I really hope you've seen our footage that we talked about of Trump supporters storming the Capitol building last January. Robert Moore and his team were the only broadcast journalists to enter with them and tell the full story of those people and ask why they were there that day. And his powerful eyewitness reporting really, for me, is journalism at its finest. It's shocking that other people weren't doing it. As Kabul fell last summer, we were the only team of British journalists, TV journalists, who reported from the Taliban side of the city, literally there next to them as it happened. And just last week, Raghi Omar was in Kenya to see firsthand the impact of the war in Ukraine on food security in Africa, really relating it rather than just writing about it. In the UK, we have relentlessly exposed the shocking conditions of tenants in social housing across the country. You might have seen it, the pictures, because they've gone everywhere. Pictures of mould and damp going down the walls. Really, really shocking. But it had been going on for years, and nobody was highlighting it. But we did, and we finally prompted policy change and action. And so this was a story no one picked up, but then resonated with so many people. And it was about those at the heart of the story. And as we said, if you follow British politics, the Partygate scandal, which really for me was an example of teamwork our end, going for detail after detail and holding those in authority to account, but always relating it back to everybody and remembering what it was like at those times and crucially remaining impartial. All of those stories have had great impact and seen our journalism picked up and praised widely. And we've been winning all the big awards, which is lovely, including the Royal Television Society's National News Programme of the Year, 2 years in a row for News at 10, and most recently a BAFTA for Best News Coverage. But clearly it's not just about TV programmes doing well. And as I said, we can't just sit back and assume our audiences will come to us. For me, the point of this kind of journalism is that it cuts through on digital too. For every story, we have a plan to maximise impact across digital and social channels, choosing to maintain the same standards, the same compliance, the same regulations as we expect on TV, even though it's not regulated in any way. So people know it's the same impartial, balanced reporting they can trust wherever they see it. And for me, this is the very great opportunity and excitement of digital reporting, is being able to adapt the way you tell your stories, the same story, to different audiences. So whether that's our youngest viewers, our teenage viewers with our daily service, The Rundown, or on our TikTok clips, or our YouTube or podcast audiences wanting to know more about what's behind a story or the longer take, or those who come to the website for the expert analysis of our specialist editors. Powerful, bold and original journalism works across the board, with the added bonus of seeing in real time the interest, the engagement, the relevance. And of course, the wealth of digital outlets means a place for telling different stories too, and a wider range of issues and more creative ways of storytelling. As you said, I'm due to take over as Chief Exec in September, which is a real privilege. But I can't pretend the wider landscape for news is easy. There's a lot on my intro. Public service broadcasting, I think, is such a precious and valuable ecosystem which needs preserving. But there are challenges. That whole structure is being debated widely, from the BBC and Channel 4 through to the very licenses themselves. And with that, how safe is the future of broadcast news as we know it in the UK? Without the levels of funding that underpin current TV journalism, the digital content would suffer too. As we all shift to streaming, there's a really big issue about where news sits in this world. When audiences no longer watch their TV live, how do we make sure the news doesn't go unseen and disappears? If there's no schedule, how do you stop news losing that prominent and familiar position at 10 or at 6 or at 6:30? Do audiences even know where to go to get information they can rely on at a time of crisis? In this world of ever more sophisticated mis or disinformation, and or people ending up in these echo chambers of social media, not hearing views that are any different to their own, how do we bolster impartial news based on facts, the best of mainstream media? Should we be looking at kite marking systems for online content so people know they can trust what they're reading? And how do we stay confident in our journalism when we come under attack from those in authority who question our sources, our methods, and try to make us part of the story? Are we diversifying our newsrooms fast enough to stay relevant and reflect our audiences? And most importantly for me really, how do we hold on to those audiences and that trust we've earned? I don't know if any of you will have seen the Reuters digital news report, which was published last week. Really encouraging on the one hand. The broadcasters still hold high levels of trust, as in fact public service broadcasters do around the world generally. ITV News has the highest net trust rating in the UK. But the number of people in that same survey who said they're choosing to actively avoid the news, in the UK particularly, it's called selective avoidance, has doubled in 5 years, which is quite a blow. And they're citing various things, but including the repetitiveness of the agenda and the negative impact on their mood. Other countries are similar. I think the UK is the worst. Ukraine is one of the most challenging stories of recent history, and I think our teams have produced some of the most powerful and heartbreaking eyewitness reporting in the UK. It's doing well on telly, but our digital audiences have stopped engaging. Similarly, many of us across the industry are finding our climate emergency content is just not cutting through. With younger people, we thought that would be easy, and it's not. And it's not where we want it to be. And despite our recent success at ITV, TV audiences in general we know are declining. And whilst they go down, the digital hits have yet to fill that gap. So, in the face of all that, why on earth still be a journalist? The pay can be pretty terrible, especially when you start. The hours are long and relentless, and many of us are never off. It's pretty unglamorous, as I'm sure you're finding. You can spend hours shivering outside buildings, like the Hunt Inquiry, waiting for things to happen, or you have to wade through long reports, or find you're trying to get your first meal of the day at a motorway service station at midnight. We're really lucky at ITV News to be expanding currently and have had increased funding, but many organisations are going the other way and budgets are shrinking. News content is all over social platforms, but that doesn't bring security of proper funding. We also still have a pretty low standing in the eyes of the public. I think every time the studies come out, we come below telesales people, estate agents, even bankers. I think in the latest Ipsos Mori poll, one of the only people worse than us was politicians, which is quite a low bar. But as I hope you can see, I think it's one of the best jobs you could ever do. We have the privilege of travelling around our countries and around the world to places you would never normally dream of, going into people's communities and homes and uncovering the truth. We meet everyone, from leaders and people at the top of their game, through to those really struggling at the toughest ends of society. And it's up to us to tell their stories equally, truthfully and fairly. It's rare where you have a job where every day is guaranteed to be different to the next one. It's also really good fun, and there's a lot of laughs along the way, in amongst the emotion and the hard work. And as I said at the top, we're living in really interesting times. You can feel now so much of what's going on is going to sit large in the history books, and we can be telling those stories now as they happen. For all that fragmentation of traditional media, digital reporting is presenting such a wealth of opportunity, of creative energy, a place to do things differently, to take risks, while still adhering to all those principles I've been talking about. We're still coming up with new digital products every month, where only a short time ago we wouldn't have dreamed of them. You know, who would have thought that TikTok would have been the platform that exploded with news content at the start of the Ukraine war? With a smartphone and a good mic, you can produce really high broadcast quality films at a fraction of what it would have cost in the past, and without needing that huge team behind you. And you can publish your stories how you want via your own channels. You, of course, will take your careers in a very different way to mine, but I am just delighted that anybody still wants to enter this profession. Different countries have different backdrops, and you will tell your stories in your way, but be bold and take risks. Whatever the platform or outlet, I always hope there'll be that place for eyewitness journalism with people at the heart, confident in being original but always impartial. I think the world needs reporting it can trust, and that future is in your hands.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
My pleasure.
So we have time available for questions, both in the room and online. And we'll start with one from Debbie Ransom, who's a very respected journalist in Commonwealth circles. She says, do you think different skill sets are needed to provide news on different platforms, or can one journalist tell their narrative across the many platforms available today? Is there a role for specialisation today?
Yeah, I'll split those. I think a modern journalist needs those skills, and certainly I think it's been quite eye-opening for telly people who thought we never wrote, and now we need to write, and we need to write for SEO, and we need to think about how we're doing our stories. So I just think you have to acquire those skills, and certainly a lot of our top correspondents will absolutely write the text that's going to go on the website. They will work out the clips that we might put for social, as well as doing the report. There's a team supporting them. So, of course, we have our digital experts behind them. But I think to really have impact, you ought to be across all of those. Having said that, there's amazing skill in writing long form. And just, you can specialise in a beautiful long piece of magazine journalism. And it doesn't mean you have to be able to do a minute 30 for ITV's evening news. I think there is also a lot of room for specialisation in terms of specialist subjects, and really we have our specialist editors who have years of experience in their areas, and being able to do that analysis and bring all of that to it. So I don't think you have to do everything, but I really think it's worth it setting out, because if you want your stories to fly, you want them to fly on whatever platform.
Thank you. Sue Onslow.
What do you have to say in terms of advice to young journalists beginning about the importance of journalist solidarity versus competitiveness? I'd be very interested to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is competitive. I mean, one thing I tried to talk about, what I learned along the way, was working in teams and the power of teams. My newsroom, traditionally TV newsrooms used to be very macho, about the biggest ego, the loudest voice, who could push themselves on. And I think this is okay to say, I've worked in bits of the BBC where people are competing against each other rather than the opposition. But I think you are much better when you work together. And so realising that coming together you can produce something good. But of course it's competitive, but I don't think that means you trample on everyone else along the way. There is room for all these ideas. There's not a saturation point. So I think if you are confident in what you're coming up with, you don't necessarily have to worry about what that person's doing. What you do have to have is initiative. And I think you have to spot the person who might lead to something for you and find a way to go and talk to them and get in there. And we have a lovely example of a journalist who is now very senior at Sky News. He used to work with us, and he, while still a student, still doing A-levels possibly, he was still a student, spotted our sports editor at the Olympics where he was volunteering and just went up to him on a bus and said, I'd like some work experience. He was put through to me, and we got him in, and we got him in 1 day a week, and by the end of his final year he was earning money with us and launched his career. And it's just because he spotted that opportunity. Now, loads of other people could have done that. They didn't. He got in there. So I think you have to have initiative and seize opportunities. That doesn't mean trampling all over everyone else, if you know what I mean.
Thanks very much. My name's Thomas, and we're from Queen's Radio in Belfast, and thank you so much for a really wonderful address, really comprehensive. We really enjoyed it. Coming off sort of the back of that last question as well, in terms of that sense of competition in the market, you talked about trying to make ITV through ITN distinctive from BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5. How do you think you go about, especially on stuff like the 6 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news, making your news distinct, but also and reaching a new audience and trying to encourage people to consume your news rather than other people's, while still covering essentially invariably, the top couple of stories will still be the same? How do you go about trying to inject that sense of distinctiveness through covering what is essentially in many cases, the same content, especially at the start of a big bulletin,
Thank you. Several things in there. One of the ways we try to be distinctive is to do our own journalism and lead the way, so break stories, or just do our own stuff. And one of the things that I very much did when I came in was slightly ban the word feature. I didn't want anybody doing features that sit at the bottom of the programme. If we're going to do our own journalism, we want it to be able to sit at the top of our programmes. And so someone might say, oh, this issue is interesting. It's like, no, come back with some data. Come back with somebody we're going to go after. Who's the bad guy in this? Or something that gives it a really hard news edge. And then we put it at the top of our programmes. So then when everybody else is reporting, this report was issued today, actually we're coming in with something different. You can still do that other stuff further down the bulletin, but it's having that confidence in your own journalism, and then people come to you for something else as well. Preferably that's then agenda setting and everyone's catching up with you. Another way we do it is our programmes have quite a feel. So News at 10, which was an institution for years, a few years ago, we looked at it again slightly before I came in, but feeling that no one sits down at 10 o'clock at night now, having seen nothing all day, going, oh, what's happened today? They will have read stuff and seen stuff. So actually it was, we're going to give you a bit of a take on it, now still completely impartial, but take you on a bit more of a conversation. Or, if something's shocking, we're going to say, that's shocking. Not, we believe the government is awful, but, wow, look at this today. So it stays impartial, but it just gives something a bit different. It's not talking at you. And I think something we've tried to do across the board with all our programmes is humanise it a lot, and particularly with either our presenters or our reporters, being a bit more, we're like you, because we are. And certainly during COVID, we tried to get that sense of we're all in this together. And, our presenter would say, this is really tough. Or say at the end, stay safe. And I think just making it a bit more relatable, so not talking down. And similarly, our reporters out and about during COVID and in Ukraine recently, if you're talking to someone who's just pouring their heart out to you, rather than being stony, just showing a bit of empathy. And I think that's made us stand out and feel a bit more relatable. But certainly in terms of the stories of the day, we are always looking at ways to knock it on. Or what else can we chase? We spend a lot of time discussing, so it's not, this is the story. So what do we think's underneath the story? And my point's about who do we chase on this? Who do we have a go at quite often? And it just takes it that bit further. The other thing we try to do is, it might be there's a story that's on our evening news. We try and generate some interest about what's changed by 10 o'clock, and certainly with a lot of our big Partygate scoops recently, we actually put it out on digital first, usually, and watch the response. So by the time we're going on air, it's like, we're already seeing this happening. And then by 10 o'clock, we're reporting as much on the response to our story as the original story. So it does feel like it's developing and moving, rather than this is what happened this morning. So you're just always pushing it and seeing where else you can take it, I think.
Hi, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. So I was wondering, in the past year and a half, I believe, the launch of GB News and the new Piers Morgan vehicle has been rather unsuccessful, to put it that way. And I'm just wondering, what is it about the UK, considering that the print media environment is so incredibly partisan and rabid, that the sort of Fox News, Sky News Australia model seemingly hasn't worked here? And is it just that the country's so used to public service broadcasting that this sort of, it just doesn't work here? Or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's possibly a bit too early to totally write them off. I think there were lots of people before they launched saying, this is going to be seismic, or this is terrible, or it's awful. And, you know, we certainly welcome as much plurality as you like. I mean, it's good to see different forms of news, and there's still regulation. Yeah, I think it's that. I think you don't, there's not a tradition of going to your broadcast news for opinion in that sense. And so people like to get their facts from their news and their truth. There's plenty of other debate elsewhere. You know, you can go on radio stations and all sorts of other things. So we don't lack debate in this country. It's just you don't necessarily have to have it in your news programmes. I think it's been interesting to see how they develop. And we're in heightened politics at the moment, but we're not in an election. And I think let's see what happens when an election comes through. But I like to think, I wouldn't be so complacent, but I like to think that everything I've been talking about with eyewitness journalism actually makes for far more compelling TV news than people arguing in studios. And as I said, that was the thing was as shocking for me about the Capitol. You know, our team were amazing and brilliant, but everyone was too busy standing in studios arguing in the States and or you know, debating whether it was right or wrong. It's like nothing beats getting stuck in there with the people. So I hope it's that as well. It's just about what's interesting and good to watch. But we'll see. You know, I mean, I don't think they're over.
Thank you. Thank you for a great speech. I just picked up on the fact that you were talking about smartphones and how you were saying, you know, it gives everyone the opportunity to tell their own story and things like that. I'm interested in, from a managerial perspective, what is the attitude towards mobile journalism within, you know, journalists at ITV News? Because obviously the smartphone gives us the ability to reach wider audiences, and as you say, like it's a great alternative to maybe using bigger, more expensive cameras sometimes. A lot of journalists like have different mindsets about it. I personally love shooting and editing on a smartphone, but just from a managerial perspective, like what is the attitude at ITV News with encouraging people to use it or not so? What's the kind of deal with that?
Yeah, it's a total mixture. For me, it's about the story. So there are some stories that are just done so much more successfully. I remember really quite some time ago, we had access to Dignitas and somebody who was choosing to end their own life. And we were there with them, not for the moment, but in the run-up to it. And there was a camera operator, but he took a mobile phone because it was so much more intimate and it wasn't a big camera in your face at such a crucial moment. And so he filmed it beautifully and no one would have known, but it just allowed that to happen better. We have quite a few journalists at ITV London who use them a lot, and it's much better and it works and you wouldn't know. I think if you're on a traditional big scrum outside the High Court and you need a bit of that going on, then maybe having a bigger camera is easier. for me, it's all about shooting well as well, and it's sort of in the hands of the person using it. We are using much more smaller cameras as well, DSLRs. I think it just gives a lovely look, obviously, and for a certain story, it's right. There's also been a problem for years of camera operators having terribly bad backs after years of doing it, so anything on the kind of safety side of it. But no, I think great, and particularly if you're out in the field, you can so quickly get clips back for digital or social. Actually using them in that sense is great. So yeah, so long as it's done well, I have no snobbery about it.
I can just tell a story that the first newspaper I worked on, the chief photographer still used the speed graphic camera, the sort of thing you see in 1930s movies, while everybody else was using, single lens reflexes. And I said to him, why are you still using that? Does it give better quality of picture? And he just looked at me and said, you hit somebody with this, they stay down.
No, exactly.
Sorry, Rita.
Yeah, I'm Rita Payne, Compliment Journalists Association, ex-BBC, as I said. Well, when I was training in my early days, there was a clear distinction between news and opinion and commentary. Now that's blurred. Are you concerned about it, or do you think that this is the way things are going to go?
Yeah, talk about this a lot, because I think there is a place for opinion in news, but I think it has to be impartial and informed and based on fact and based on your specialism. So I think that our specialist editors can give their take on a story. I think this is the way it is, or I see this and I think this is what it's about because of this, this and this. That's very different to saying I think this government is corrupt, or my personal view is. And I am quite worried. I've talked about this a bit, that we'll get to the stage where sort of all opinion is banned, and that for me makes for very bland news as well. It doesn't mean we're biased or we're trying to sway people, but sometimes the reasons when you tune is you want somebody with knowledge of that subject to give you their expert take. And I think that's okay. I think that's a good thing. But we are very under the spotlight for it. And certain people will be very quick to judge you and say it's not an impartial opinion. And it's a bit, for me, it's a bit like balance and this sort of false balance. And the BBC's had a lot of it. But this idea that you have to balance everything. Now, I think you balance pretty much everything. But if you've got a really extreme view, you don't have to go and find the most extreme view to balance that. We are not putting climate skeptics into all our climate emergency pieces, because I think the overwhelming body of scientific evidence is that it is happening. When we were doing a lot of Me Too stuff, you don't have to find the one person who thinks it's fine to do all that. So I worry sometimes that we get very caught up in what balance is and what opinion is. But if it's based in impartiality and facts, I think it's fine, and I think it has a place.
Hi, I'm going to join everyone else in thanking you for the address.
Thank you.
My question is concerning what you said about people switching off from news, about the repetition of it, the same stories going again and again, day after day. How do you balance that with, like, if you watch any of the coverage of Ukraine, like the on-the-ground coverage, one of the things you hear again and again is don't let this news melt into the background.
Yeah.
Don't let it, fall back into the back of people's minds. How do you balance that with the sense of giving the audience variety?
It's really hard. It's really hard. And I think Ukraine, we have a duty to keep telling what's going on there, particularly with all the misinformation, disinformation coming from Russia and other places. And there's we do debate how much of a presence to keep there. There was a stage we had about 5 teams there. We're down to kind of 1.5 at the moment, and we'll scale back up if we need to. Journalists also can have quite short attention spans. So I do quite often have people in the newsroom going, we want something else. I'm like, sorry, this one matters. I want to keep telling it. And in fact, for our TV audiences, we haven't seen people switching off. I worked a lot on the foreign desk at ITV News when the Arab Spring was happening, and particularly Syria was happening, and I care passionately and personally about all of it. But we hit this stage where if you led on Syria on News at 10, everyone switched off. And it was sort of heartbreaking because you come up with a really important story. People didn't want it. And, how do you do that? At the moment, that's not happening on telly. As I said, interestingly, on digital, people aren't engaging. So we're probably doing a bit less. We're still covering it, but dialing up the other things we're doing. I think it's been really tough the last few years with these long, ongoing stories. The really hard one was Brexit, because Brexit really mattered. But, Amendment 47 and Debate 500 and all the rest of it was quite difficult to tell, but also I'm sure people were switching off. But we also felt we had to tell people what was going on. I think for us it's mixing it up, and this is why we've done these different original stories, and they do cut through and do something different with it. But like I say, easier on online, easier on digital, because you can do different things for different platforms where you're seeing it. I say on Ukraine, we definitely learned quite a lesson at the beginning of the war, because we tend to put all our news gathering into one basket on something like that. And so telly was looking fantastic and all these different angles on it, and digital was saying, hang on, we haven't got the content now, and people want something else. But yeah, it's a really hard balance, particularly when you have limited resources. But we have to keep, it's a juggle. We don't get it right every day. Keep trying.
Can I ask, actually, when you say people switch off digitally on these stories, what stories do they switch on to?
All the big sort of exclusive original stuff does really, really well. Mm-hmm. As I said, that sort of journalism flies everywhere. You will know this is the talk of the moment, explainers. Everyone loves an explainer. And often it's an explainer around a wider issue around the question rather than the sort of top line of the day. Anything that has really good picture and an issue and emotion, mm-hmm. they always fly. So if you can get those things together. Our specialist analysis always does really well. Mm-hmm. So a blog by Robert Peston, or if there's a big health story, Emily Morgan, or Rohit Khatri, who does all our security stuff, just where a bit of that expert stuff, that cuts through really well. And, often just a great bit of picture. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily mean clickbait, doesn't mean a cat flying out of a tree, but, something interesting.
Richard.
Richard Bourne, I'm the conference organizer, and can I say what a brilliant keynote speech that was, and we're all grateful to you. My question is slightly different, really. We've got a worldwide participation this morning, and it won't always be this morning in other parts of the world. But my question really is about what impact you think ITN has had in its broadcasting in being picked up outside the UK. And I'm thinking particularly of issues like the Ukraine war, where we know that attitudes in Africa and South Asia are quite varied with regard to the virtues of Russia and Ukraine in this struggle. And also some of the other issues, like, for example, you were describing the brilliant coverage by Robert Moore of the invasion of the Capitol. Obviously, there's a pickup in the United States of your work. Can you say something about how it is being used, whether some of these issues of sort of weariness, of repetition and stuff apply to your worldwide pickup, or whether actually people are so desperate for quality independent journalism that all over the world you are getting people watching and listening?
Yeah, lots in that. I mean, we are a British broadcaster, so we are aimed very much at that audience, though our digital stuff goes everywhere. Robert's reporting from the Capitol, yes, was picked up hugely in the States, and he was on every single news breakfast show going, I think. But there was also an international demand for him, and so he was picked up by Europeans, but also Asian broadcasters all round. So that one really resonated. I think with the rest of our stuff, it's a mixture. I mean, some things cut through. Jess, who's sitting next to, who's in charge of all our comms, often monitors, and I'm staggered sometimes. Our stuff will be picked up in a Singaporean newspaper or in a Kenyan newspaper, all the rest of it, because it does cut cut through. And I think some of the things like Partygate, because everyone remembers COVID and that does come through. I think in terms of how do we adapt, I think we don't. I think good impartial journalism should work anywhere. And I don't think we take a sort of British view necessarily. I think some of our stuff is about translating to a British audience. And I think if we were aiming it at an international audience, it might have a slightly different view to it. And it's interesting what you were talking about with Rwanda coming in. I think there's one of the things that I was looking at our coverage and trying to decide if we got right. And when we first went to cover the whole policy of sending asylum seekers, I think we overly went on the what an awful thing to do, because we were trying to hold our government to account, and it had the potential to look like we were somehow attacking Rwanda when that was not the story. And we tweaked, we corrected it after that, because it just felt like the wrong tone. And so I think we do have to be mindful of all of that. And sometimes when you have your great British political journalists just going at the British politicians, you can miss some of that wider context. But no, and I think most of it cuts through. And I do think on Ukraine, I think all of us called it a bit more as a story of the right side and the wrong side. I mean, we didn't quite say the right side and the wrong side, but we called it a war from day one. And although Russia was not wanting us to call it a war, we had our teams in Russia, but we didn't start calling it a fight against the Nazis or whatever they wanted us to. And there are some things with Ukraine that just needed to be said, I think, rather than being so 100% balanced that we put the Russian view as much as elsewhere. Now, if that didn't sit well in Russia, that's difficult. We didn't get thrown out or anything, so hopefully that was right. But we're not 100% balanced in that sense.
Thank you so much for this speech. My name is Dr. Karen Hassan, and I'm from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. There is a mistrust for televised journalism all across the world. And my question is, what are the challenges? What are your teams constantly? Because obviously, sometimes the critical stories are out on social media way before the traditional mainstream media gets hands on those stories. So, what are the challenges as a producer or editor, whereby you actually also see which ones are the fake news which come to you? I mean, these are the kind of questions. If you'd just like to throw some light on that.
Yeah, loads in there again. I'm going to say I was really pleased by the Reuters report that I mentioned, the trust survey, and that broadcasters are kind of up there amongst the most trusted. So without being complacent, I like to think we sit in a different place to some print journalists and the rest of it. I think I've always said this about broadcast and particularly television. Yes, you can manipulate it if you so wanted to, but people either say something to you on camera or they don't. And yes, you could chop it in the middle. We're not in the business of that. Whereas print and even audio, you can manipulate a bit more. So it's either there or it's not. So I think there's something about the medium of television which helps with that. But I think there's been quite a move, and we're doing quite a lot of it, and others are, of finding ways through your digital outlets particularly, of doing a bit more transparency about how we got the story. And whether that's through our podcasts, we do a What You Need to Know podcast, which often takes the story and goes behind the scenes. And we might explain how we got to a story. And just, I think, doing more of that and showing, we fact check and we do look for balance, and this is what it's based on. So I think that helps quite a lot. And just getting away the idea of we're going to preach down to you, actually to come in with us and see what's going on. I think the fact that we choose to stick to the same Ofcom regulations that we have for television in all our digital stuff, even though we don't have to do any of it, to just show you can trust it in amongst it. I mentioned this idea of kite marking, which ITN would like, a sort of stamp of trust, really, on digital content, and that's something that we are talking about, and we'd like to see that in future legislation, to really signpost people on it. And I think, yeah, it's just being open. Again, what we try to do, it's as much about having impact with our journalism, but I think it helps with the credibility. I was saying that I don't like a feature, and if someone comes along, I was like, no, go get some data and all the rest of it. Really bringing data in to underpin it will often help. So we might partner with an organisation to get us the data and get us the figures. Now, I know you can do anything with data, but I think having a bit of that helps support it. And obviously, the explosion of data journalism is quite interesting, and we've done quite a lot. I call it forensic journalism. That's just my word for it. Where it's not just doing the story with the data journalism, but really taking the viewer through the process. And our security editor does quite a lot of this, and he'll get some picture from Syria and say, right, we did this Google mapping, or we did this search, and this is how we honed in on this. And look, we got that number plate, and we don't. And it's just that's the story is taking you through. So I hope some of that helps, and I hope just continuing to have the confident journalism. What I try to do is not get wrapped up too much in the debate, and say, right, this is what we do, and making sure people know how to find us. In a similar way, sorry, this is a very long answer, there have been times over the last few years particularly where a lot of news media have got caught up in rows with the government and publicly engaging in some of what you might be calling mis or disinformation. And I try to avoid that. I don't like us to be the story. I think our journalism should be the story. And so it's just, not engaging a lot of that. And I hope that's paying off with what we're doing.
So can I abuse my position
You
as
can.
chair again and ask a bit more about the kite marking? I mean, who would do the kite marking? This is the crucial question.
Everything to discuss. But it might be that as an organisation, you agree to abide by like the Ofcom regulations, and that gives you the ability to put the kite marking in. At the moment you can do a blue tick on Twitter, can't you? But it's something a bit more comprehensive than that. And it's as much about future products that we don't even know what they are as the current channels. And you can go to a social media channel and pick ITV News or pick the Telegraph or pick anyone that is sticking to these principles. But it's as much for whatever the new world looks like as well. But it's something we want to see debated and see what that looks like.
Hi. So my question is more about sort of impartiality, because I feel as though there's sort of two main critiques levelled against like a lot of journalists and sort of media organisations. And I think the first is sort of what's actually written in terms of substance, and I feel as though that's perhaps more obvious to address. And the second's more about sort of coverage and the sorts of stories you choose to prioritise, and others that you may not be able to publish and put so far forward. So I guess my question is, how do you sort of decide which stories to best resource and really sort of take forwards, and how do you sort of make sure that impartiality is maintained in light of that?
Yeah, really good question. And impartiality itself is being questioned a lot at the moment. I think, for me, what's key to that is one of the things that I mentioned in my talk. You have to have a mixture of voices, a mixture of opinions, a mixture of people around the table. And a lot of what is levelled correctly in some places at mainstream media is you've got a bunch of liberal Londoners sitting around the table making the decisions. So for me, it's very much having people from across the UK, people from across of backgrounds in that room making the decisions. And we believe really strongly in having people outside London, and in fact we've increased our presence. But it's making sure you're listening to them as well. So when they tell you, no, that's not the view, and actually not everyone thinks that's bad, that you balance it a bit. And for me, I always try and question the kind of wisdom, perceived wisdom around the room. And you have to keep challenging. But diversity is the answer to all of it, I think.
Hiya, Emer Smith, Queen's Radio. I was wondering, you said yourself that you fell into journalism as such, and I was wondering whether from like your own experience or from seeing other people kind of come through it, whether it's better to kind of cover like certain niche of stories, especially at the start perhaps, or whether it's better to kind of diversify rather than being just purely a political or environmental kind of journalist, whether it's good to diversify?
Yeah, I was convinced when I left university that I needed a specialism, and I started an MA in Mediterranean Studies, which was amazing, and I wish I'd finished it, because I thought I needed something. I was learning Arabic, and I was learning about former Yugoslavia, and I was doing North Africa and the war that's going on in Lebanon. I thought, that's my route into it. I did a week of it, realised I had, excuse me, no money to pay for it. But at the same time, I was finding stories all around me, and selling them into these Radio 4 programmes. So it's like, actually, seize opportunities rather than thinking, I have to be this or I have to have a niche. Your niche might come where you're not looking for it.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
You've really got this conference off to a flying start. Thank you to everyone in the room who asked intelligent questions. And I hope if you can stay, by all means do, but we understand you
might be dashing.
Very busy.
But no, genuinely, I'm really delighted that you all want to do it. And I think, yeah, be confident, be bold, and walk up to people and ask them for work experience, or just walk up and say, can I spend a day, or any of that. Everyone comes over here now. But genuinely, because it's about making your own opportunities as well.
Oh, can I give you my card?
Yes. Come on in and make the tea. Thank you.